The world is watching, whether it fully realizes it or not, as ancient prophecies begin to unfold right before our eyes. What started as a whisper, a strange anomaly on the edges of our collective awareness, has now grown into a roar that echoes across every continent. A global crisis, at first dismissed as just another challenge in a long line of them, has escalated into something far more sinister, something that feels eerily familiar to warnings etched into sacred texts thousands of years ago. It's a feeling many can't quite name, but it's there, a cold knot in the stomach. We saw it begin with what seemed like a necessary step, a new global policy presented with urgency and a veneer of protection swept across nations. It promised solutions, stability, a return to normalcy. But beneath the surface of its well-intentioned language, something else was happening. Freedoms, once considered fundamental, began to subtly erode. Necessities, things we took for granted, became contingent on compliance. It was a slow, almost imperceptible tightening, like a net being drawn in. This wasn't just about managing a crisis. It felt like a deeper, systemic control was emerging, reshaping the very fabric of how we live, how we interact, and what we are allowed to be. The rhetoric from world leaders became increasingly unified, a single voice speaking of collective good, while the individual good seemed to shrink. We were told it was for our safety, for the greater benefit of humanity, but the cost felt heavy. Access to resources, even the simple act of movement, started to hinge on proving allegiance to this new global order. It's a chilling thought when you consider how easily an entire population can be herded, not by force alone, but by the promise of security and the fear of exclusion. This isn't just a random series of unfortunate events. There's a pattern here, a design that feels too intricate to be accidental. It's almost as if the stage has been set for generations, slowly, meticulously, for this very moment. The subtle manipulations by powerful entities, often unseen and unnamed, have guided us here, leveraging our vulnerabilities, our fears, and even our hopes. They've woven a narrative that makes us believe we are choosing our path, when in reality, the options presented are merely different routes to the same predetermined destination. And yet, in the midst of this unsettling shift, there's a quiet knowing that settles in the hearts of some, a recognition of the deception, a flicker of understanding that this grand play, with all its global actors and dramatic pronouncements, is merely a shadow of something much larger, much older. It reminds us that sometimes the solutions offered can be more dangerous than the problems they claim to solve, especially when those solutions demand the surrender of our very essence. The air is thick with unease. The world holds its breath, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, but sensing that the ground beneath our feet is shifting in ways we've never experienced. This isn't just history repeating itself. This feels like prophecy unfolding, a chilling testament to warnings that have been whispered through time. The true forces at play are becoming clearer, their intentions slowly revealing themselves through the cracks of this manufactured reality. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This precarious moment we find ourselves in, this global stage set for what feels like an inevitable drama, didn't just appear overnight. It's the culmination of centuries of subtle shifts, a gradual erosion of foundations that once seemed unshakable. To truly understand the depth of the current crisis and the chilling echoes of biblical warnings, we need to trace our steps back, examining how humanity arrived at this vulnerable precipice. For a long time, there was a quiet understanding of spiritual values, a reverence for something beyond the tangible. Faith, in its various forms, provided a moral compass, a framework for understanding our place in the universe and our responsibilities to each other. But as centuries turned, a new narrative began to take hold. Secular ideologies, born from a desire for human autonomy and scientific progress, slowly but surely chipped away at this spiritual bedrock. The focus shifted from the divine to the human, from eternal truths to temporal achievements. This wasn't a sudden rejection, but a slow, almost imperceptible drift. We grew to value reason above revelation, empirical evidence above inherited wisdom. The mysteries of faith were often dismissed as superstitions, replaced by the certainty of scientific discovery and technological advancement. While progress brought undeniable benefits, It also fostered a new kind of reliance, a belief that every problem could be solved through human ingenuity alone. We began to look outward for solutions, often forgetting the inner landscape, the spiritual dimension that once anchored us. Technology, in particular, became both our greatest hope and perhaps our most subtle enslaver. From simple tools to complex digital networks, it promised to connect us, to empower us, to free us from the limitations of the past. And in many ways it delivered. But it also created a new set of dependencies, a constant hum of information and distraction that began to drown out the quieter voices of introspection and spiritual discernment. We became increasingly reliant on algorithms to guide our choices, on screens to mediate our interactions, on systems to provide our security. The human spirit, once seen as a direct connection to the divine, became just another data point, another component in an ever-expanding technological matrix. This reliance on external solutions fostered a collective vulnerability. As we distanced ourselves from spiritual truths, we also became more susceptible to grand deceptions. The human desire for comfort, for security, for a pain-free existence was subtly exploited. Promises of utopia, achievable through human effort and clever engineering, became increasingly appealing. We yearned for a world without suffering, and anything that promised to deliver it, even at the cost of our individual freedoms or spiritual autonomy, seemed like a worthwhile trade. The scriptures, of course, speak of these very conditions. They warn of a time when people would be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. They speak of a great falling away, a deception so pervasive that it would mislead even the elect, the rise of secularism, the increasing reliance on technology over faith, the collective aspirations for a human-made paradise. These are not just historical trends. They are the fertile ground upon which the prophecies for the end times can take root and flourish. Humanity, in its pursuit of progress and its rejection of the transcendent, has inadvertently created the perfect environment for global deception and systemic control to thrive. We've built a world where our vulnerabilities are amplified, where our aspirations are easily manipulated, and where our spiritual defenses have been systematically dismantled. This isn't to say that human ingenuity is inherently bad, or that progress is to be feared. Rather, it highlights the delicate balance that was lost, the spiritual awareness that once provided a crucial filter against the siren calls of worldly promises. This historical overview, this journey through the erosion of spiritual values and the rise of technological reliance, provides the essential backdrop to the unfolding events. It explains how our world became ripe for the deceptions we now face, how humanity, collectively, became so susceptible to the narratives spun by world leaders and powerful entities. The stage is not merely set, it has been meticulously prepared, brick by spiritual brick, for the dramatic entrance of forces that have been foretold for millennia. The question is, can we still see the truth amidst the carefully constructed illusion? The path to our current global predicament was not paved by sudden, cataclysmic events alone, but by the slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of emotional cracks within the fabric of society. Decades, even centuries, of subtle shifts in thought and belief have eroded our collective spiritual and moral foundations. We can look back and see how certain trends, seemingly harmless at the time, have had a profound and lasting impact on the present. One of the most significant was the normalization of moral relativism, the idea that truth was subjective, that right and wrong were merely personal constructs, gradually dissolved the shared ethical framework that once bound communities. What began as an intellectual exercise in philosophy trickled down into everyday life, fostering a climate where personal preference often trumped universal principles. This erosion coincided with the breakdown of traditional institutions. Family structures, religious organizations, and even local communities, which once provided meaning, support, and a sense of belonging, began to fray. They were seen as outdated, restrictive, or simply irrelevant in a rapidly modernizing world. As these pillars weakened, humanity became more isolated, more susceptible to external influences, and more desperate for new sources of guidance and identity. The void left by these crumbling institutions was often filled by consumerism, entertainment, and the ever-present hum of technology, offering fleeting distractions rather than genuine connection. Hand in hand with this institutional decay was a growing spiritual apathy. The vibrant spiritual life that once characterized many societies faded into a quiet indifference. Organized religion saw declining attendance, and personal faith became a private, often unspoken matter. This wasn't necessarily a hostile rejection of spirituality, but rather a gradual disengagement as the demands of modern life and the allure of material comforts overshadowed the deeper questions of existence. This widespread apathy made humanity less discerning, less attuned to the spiritual undercurrents of the world, and thus more vulnerable to deceptions that operated on a spiritual level. We were promised utopia through human-centric philosophies. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and individual liberty, led to grand visions of a perfect society built solely on human intellect and effort. Marxism promised a classless paradise, while various forms of liberalism championed progress through social engineering and technological innovation. Each, in its own way, offered a compelling narrative of human advancement, but consistently failed to deliver on its grandest promises. These broken promises left a residue of disillusionment, a sense that something fundamental was missing, even as the pursuit of these earthly heavens continued. Humanity, having rejected divine guidance, kept searching for salvation in human constructs, only to find them wanting. Throughout this historical journey, there have been veiled manipulations by powerful entities. These were not always overt acts of malice, but often subtle nudges, carefully crafted narratives, and strategic interventions that steered society in particular directions. Think of the rise of central banking systems, the shaping of educational curricula, or the control over information dissemination. These influences, often operating behind the scenes, gradually consolidated power and shaped public opinion, preparing the ground for the systemic control that is now becoming so apparent. There were also moments of spiritual injustice, where the voices of truth and conscience were suppressed, marginalized, or ridiculed. Those who warned against the dangers of moral decay, who spoke of the enduring importance of faith, or who challenged the prevailing secular narratives, were often dismissed as fanatics or relics of a bygone era. This systematic silencing of dissenting spiritual voices further weakened humanity's ability to resist the encroaching global deception. The stage was being set not by a single dramatic act, but by 1,000 small concessions, 1,000,000 tiny shifts in perspective, and a gradual erosion of spiritual fortitude. The global crisis we now face, the one that triggered the new global policies and the subtle stripping of freedoms, is not an isolated incident. It is the culmination of centuries of spiritual and moral decline. It is the harvest of a world that increasingly chose human ingenuity over divine wisdom, self-interest over communal good, and fleeting comfort over eternal truth. These accumulated cracks, these broken promises, these veiled manipulations have created the precise conditions for the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse to ride. Humanity, in its pursuit of a self-made paradise, has inadvertently opened the gates to its greatest challenges, challenges that were foretold long ago. The world now finds itself at a precipice, a moment where the accumulated emotional cracks have widened into chasms, and the global landscape feels heavy, almost unsustainable. The initial crisis, once a subtle hum in the background, has intensified, its tendrils reaching into every aspect of daily life. Conflicts, both overt and covert, are intensifying across the globe, fueled by ancient grievances and new anxieties. Economic pressures mount relentlessly, squeezing the life out of once thriving communities and pushing countless individuals to the brink. The promise of prosperity, once a cornerstone of the modern dream, feels like a cruel joke for many. Social divisions, carefully nurtured over decades by narratives of difference and resentment, have deepened into impassable canyons. It's as if the very fabric of society is being pulled apart, thread by painful thread. The world leaders, instead of offering solace or genuine solutions, have adopted an increasingly demanding narrative. Their words, once cloaked in promises of immediate relief, now carry an unmistakable tone of urgency and non-negotiable compliance. Every new policy, every new directive seems designed to further restrict movement, thought, and even personal choice, all in the name of collective safety or stability. This era has seen the unmistakable rise of global governance initiatives. What once seemed like abstract concepts discussed in international forums now manifest as tangible systems, weaving their way into national laws and individual lives. These initiatives, presented as essential for managing global challenges like climate change, pandemics, or economic instability, are steadily eroding national sovereignty and centralizing power. They promise efficiency and order, but at the cost of local autonomy and individual freedom. Humanity, accustomed to comfort and convenience, often accepts these changes with a sigh of weary resignation, too exhausted to question the long-term implications. Dissenting voices, once a vibrant, if sometimes inconvenient part of democratic discourse, are now swiftly and systematically suppressed. Social media algorithms are fine-tuned to filter out non-conformist views. Mainstream news outlets present a unified front, and those who dare to speak out are quickly labeled as misinformers, extremists, or threats to public safety. The public square, once a place for robust debate, has become a carefully curated echo chamber, where only approved narratives are allowed to resonate. The sheer volume of information, combined with the constant fear-mongering, creates an atmosphere of suffocating control. People feel watched, judged, and increasingly isolated in their thoughts. The fear-mongering itself has become a constant, pervasive. News cycles are dominated by threats, real and exaggerated, keeping humanity in a perpetual state of anxiety. Whether it's the next variant, the next economic downturn, or the next geopolitical flashpoint, the message is clear. Danger is everywhere, and only the world leaders, guided by powerful entities, can protect us. This constant state of alarm drains spiritual energy, making people less capable of critical thought and more prone to seeking refuge in whatever solutions are offered, no matter how restrictive. This period represents the moment of greatest societal and spiritual suffocation, just before the direct manifestation of the prophetic events. The air feels thick with unspoken anxieties, with a sense of impending change that no one can quite articulate but everyone feels. The global deception has reached its apex, having successfully convinced a significant portion of humanity that their salvation lies in relinquishing individual liberties for the promise of collective security. The spiritual apathy, the moral relativism, the broken institutions, all have culminated in a world ripe for command and control. The stage is not just set, the actors are in position, the lights are dimmed, and the curtain is about to rise on the next, more dramatic act of the prophecy. Humanity, in its collective slumber, is about to witness the direct consequences of its choices. As the ancient warnings begin to manifest in undeniable ways, the pressure is immense, the tension palpable, and the world holds its breath, consciously or unconsciously, for what comes next. Then, a series of events began to unfold, so stark and undeniable that they shattered the illusion of control that global deception had meticulously crafted. It wasn't a slow burn anymore. It was a sudden, jarring jolt. The first undeniable crack in the facade came not from a human hand but from nature itself. A series of unprecedented natural disasters struck simultaneously across continents. Massive earthquakes far beyond anything recorded in modern history tore through densely populated areas, leaving behind unimaginable devastation. Coastal cities were swallowed by tsunamis of epic proportions, and vast swathes of agricultural land turned to desert overnight, all while other regions drowned under ceaseless, torrential rains. These weren't isolated incidents. They were synchronized, almost orchestrated, defying all previous scientific models and predictions. The scale of the destruction was so immense that it overwhelmed the capabilities of even the most technologically advanced nations. Emergency services collapsed, supply chains fractured completely, and the carefully constructed global economy began to unravel at an alarming speed. This was not just a crisis, it was a cataclysm. Humanity, accustomed to relying on its ingenuity and technological prowess to mitigate disasters, found itself utterly helpless, exposed to the raw, untamed power of the planet. The constant fear-mongering about external threats suddenly seemed trivial in comparison to the immediate visceral terror of the Earth itself turning against them. As if the natural upheavals weren't enough, a devastating revelation then followed, striking at the very heart of the global deception. Through a leak of classified documents, spearheaded by a small, courageous group of whistleblowers, the true architects of the global agenda were exposed. It wasn't just a shadowy cabal, but a vast network of powerful entities, deeply embedded within international organizations, financial institutions, and even some national governments. The documents laid bare their long-term plans, not for global stability or human welfare, but for absolute control, for the creation of a stratified world where a privileged few held sway over the masses. The revelations detailed how the previous crises, the very ones that had led to the stripping of freedoms and the rise of global governance initiatives, had been meticulously engineered, or at the very least, grossly exaggerated and exploited for specific outcomes. The initial global crisis, presented as an existential threat requiring immediate and unquestioning compliance, was revealed to be a carefully managed event, designed to usher in the very systems of control that were now suffocating humanity. The world leaders, many of whom had been presented as saviors, were now seen as either willing participants or unwitting puppets in this grand scheme. This exposure was like a dam breaking. The carefully curated narratives, the unified fronts presented by mainstream media, the suppression of dissenting voices, all crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. A wave of shock, anger, and betrayal swept across the globe. People who had previously dismissed warnings as conspiracy theories, who had dutifully complied with every new regulation, now felt a profound sense of foolishness and rage. The trust in institutions, already fragile, evaporated completely. This moment, this shattering of the cycle of deception, was the turning point. It wasn't just an intellectual understanding, it was a gut-wrenching realization that everything they had been told, everything they had believed, was a lie. The promise of collective security in exchange for individual liberty was exposed as a cruel deception, a means to an end for the powerful entities. The spiritual apathy that had allowed humanity to drift into this state of vulnerability began to recede, replaced by a raw, unfiltered awakening. It was a painful awakening, filled with regret and indignation, but an awakening nonetheless. The stage was no longer just set. The curtain had been ripped open, revealing the puppeteers behind the scenes. The direct fulfillment of the prophecies, once an abstract concept, now felt imminent, tangible, and terrifyingly real. The world was about to shift, fundamentally and irrevocably. The world now grappled with the sheer, overwhelming fallout of these revelations and the ongoing cataclysms. A pervasive fear, cold and heavy, settled over humanity. It was a primal fear, not just of the natural disasters that continued to reshape the planet, but of the profound instability that had been uncovered. The ground beneath their feet, both literally and figuratively, had given way. Doubt, like a corrosive acid, began to eat away at every established belief. People questioned everything, their leaders, their news sources, even their own judgment for having believed the lies for so long. Shame became a heavy cloak for many, a silent acknowledgement of their complicity, their passive acceptance of the global deception. This shame often festered into an emotional explosion. For some, it was despair, a crushing sense of hopelessness at the magnitude of the betrayal and the destruction. For others, it was resistance, a fierce, burning anger that demanded action, a refusal to be manipulated any longer. Different nations and cultures reacted in starkly contrasting ways, reflecting their inherent spiritual and political leanings. In some regions, particularly those already under authoritarian rule or those heavily reliant on the global deception's promised solutions, the New World Order found fertile ground. Their world leaders, quick to consolidate power amidst the chaos, spun new narratives, blaming external forces or internal dissidents for the exposure of the powerful entities. They offered a renewed promise of order and stability, however fragile, in exchange for even greater obedience. These populations, exhausted by the relentless crises and eager for any semblance of peace, often embraced the enhanced control, seeing it as the only way forward. They became the unwitting enforcers of the very system that had deceived them, their fear and desperation overriding any lingering doubts. However, in other parts of the world, particularly those with a history of valuing individual liberty and critical thought, the resistance gained momentum. Pockets of defiance began to form, small at first, then growing into significant movements. These groups, often composed of individuals who had long harbored suspicions about the global deception, now found their voices amplified by the undeniable evidence. They refused to accept the new dictates, organizing protests, forming underground networks, and seeking to rebuild trust and community on their own terms. These resistors became beacons of hope for many, demonstrating that not all of humanity was willing to surrender to the systemic control. They spoke of spiritual awakening, of reclaiming their autonomy, and of a return to fundamental truths that had been obscured by years of manipulation. The psychological impact on humanity was profound and far-reaching. People were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the world and about themselves. The comfortable illusion of safety and progress had been irrevocably shattered. Trust, once a foundational element of society, had become a rare and precious commodity. Families were torn apart by ideological differences. Friends became strangers, as some clung desperately to the old narratives, while others embraced the painful yet liberating reality of the deception. The constant state of uncertainty, the breakdown of social structures, and the raw emotional turmoil led to widespread psychological distress. Many experienced symptoms of trauma, anxiety, and depression, as the sheer weight of what had occurred and what was still unfolding pressed down upon them. The future, once a concept filled with potential, now loomed as an unknown, terrifying landscape. The world was no longer simply reacting to events. It was actively reshaping its collective psyche in the crucible of undeniable truth and unprecedented chaos. Humanity stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between the bitter comfort of continued deception or the arduous path of true awakening. As the dust settled, a new tentative quiet descended upon the fractured world. For some, this quiet was merely the calm before another storm, but for a growing segment of humanity, it marked the beginning of a profound spiritual awakening. The shock of betrayal, the raw anger, and the despair had, in many cases, burned away the layers of apathy and complacency that had long shielded them from deeper truths. People began to seek answers not just in political manifestos or scientific data, but in long-forgotten texts, in ancient wisdom, and within themselves. This awakening was not uniform. It was a fragmented, personal journey for millions, each wrestling with their own understanding of what had transpired and what it truly meant for their existence. They questioned the very foundations of their beliefs, seeking a connection to something beyond the material, something resilient enough to withstand the relentless assault of global deception. Simultaneously, the consequences for those who had orchestrated or willingly participated in the systemic control began to manifest, not always through immediate, visible justice, but through a different kind of reckoning. The powerful entities, once shrouded in impenetrable secrecy, found their influence waning as humanity's collective gaze, now sharpened by betrayal, pierced through their carefully constructed facades. World leaders who had championed the global deception found their authority eroded, their narratives dismissed, and their power bases crumbling. The systems they had so meticulously built, designed to control and manipulate, began to buckle under the weight of widespread distrust and the sheer inability to maintain the illusion any longer. Financial institutions, once considered unshakable, faced unprecedented scrutiny and withdrawal of faith, leading to a slow, agonizing unraveling. The justice unfolding was less about immediate retribution and more about the inevitable collapse of structures built on lies and exploitation. The narrative concluded with a sense of ultimate justice, not necessarily in the swift, satisfying way of human courts, but in the unfolding of divine prophecy. The events once dismissed as ancient myths had played out with chilling accuracy, revealing a grand design far beyond human comprehension. The triumph of truth, while arduous and costly, was undeniable. It was a truth forged in the crucible of suffering, a truth that demanded a complete re-evaluation of priorities, values, and the very purpose of life. The enduring power of faith, once relegated to the fringes of society, now re-emerged as a central pillar for those seeking meaning and resilience in a world fundamentally altered. It was not a faith in institutions or charismatic leaders, but a deeply personal conviction, a spiritual anchor in the swirling chaos. This journey, from subtle deception to catastrophic revelation, had irrevocably changed humanity. The comfortable illusions were gone, replaced by a stark, often painful reality. Yet within that reality, a new strength was born. The collective experience of being deceived, of witnessing the fragility of worldly power, had instilled a profound understanding of what truly mattered. The pursuit of transient pleasures and material wealth seemed hollow in the face of such monumental truths. Instead, there was a growing yearning for authenticity, for genuine connection, and for a spiritual grounding that transcended the fleeting trends of the age. The world was not healed overnight, nor were all wounds instantly mended. Scars remained, deep and visible, a constant reminder of the price paid for ignorance and complacency. But for those who had awakened, there was a quiet resolve, a commitment to learning from the past, and a determination to forge a future rooted in truth and unwavering faith. The Four Horsemen had ridden, leaving a trail of devastation and revelation. Their passage had not annihilated humanity, but rather purified it in a searing fire, leaving behind a core of resilient spirits ready to rebuild. Not on the shifting sands of deception, but on the unshakable bedrock of truth. The ultimate triumph was not the absence of struggle, but the enduring presence of hope, born from the ashes of a world forever changed, forever awake.